That moment is seared into my memory forever. Standing there in my crimson sweater, handcrafted brooch pinned to my collar, watching as Michael, my eldest son, gestured toward the rickety card table set up in the corner of his expansive dining room. "Mom, we've arranged for you to sit over there this year," he said with that dismissive smile I'd grown to recognize. "The main table is for immediate family discussions about the expansion plans." I looked over to see a miniature table, decorated with paper plates and candy canes, surrounded by 3 booster seats for my grandchildren. My daughter-in-law Rebecca didn't even look up from arranging her sterling silver centerpiece. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 40 years I'd spent building Hartwell custom furniture from a single workbench in our garage into a regional empire with showrooms in 4 states. 40 years of missed vacations, second mortgages, and 4 a.m. inventory counts. And now, at 72, I was being relegated to the children's table in the home that my business paid for, by the children who seemed to have forgotten who had given them their start. Before we dive deeper into what happened next, and believe me, they never saw it coming, tell me where you're tuning in from today. And if this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've got something special that might just change how you think about family business forever. I'm Catherine Hartwell, though most people around Milwaukee know me as Kathy. My late husband James and I started Hartwell Custom Furniture in 1978, with nothing but his carpentry skills and my eye for design. We built our first pieces in our garage while I was still working as a school secretary to keep the lights on. James handled the craftsmanship, and I managed the books, the customers, and eventually, our growing workshop of talented artisans. We raised our 3 children, Michael, Angela, and Daniel, amidst the sawdust and varnish of our growing business. They played beneath drafting tables, learned to sand wood before they could write cursive, and absorbed the language of joinery and finishes over the dinner table. I made sure they understood the value of hard work, quality, and integrity, the foundations that built Hartwell into the respected name it became. When James passed away unexpectedly from a heart attack 15 years ago, I found myself alone, at the helm of a company doing $3.5 million in annual sales, with 28 employees counting on me for their livelihoods. The children were just finishing college or starting their careers. Michael, already showing a talent for sales, joined the company immediately. Angela followed a year later after completing her business degree. Daniel, my youngest and most creative child, came aboard after a brief stint at a design firm in Chicago. Within 5 years, we had expanded to 3 showrooms and doubled our revenue. I was proud of how my children had stepped up, applying their education and fresh perspectives to modernize aspects of the business while respecting the craftsmanship that had built our reputation. Michael developed our commercial division, Angela revamped our financial systems, and Daniel created a contemporary line that attracted younger customers. As I approached my 70th birthday, I began taking more time away from day-to-day operations. I never formally retired. Hartwell was too much a part of my identity. But I stepped back to a 3-day work week, giving my children more autonomy to run the divisions they had helped build. I maintained my position as CEO and majority shareholder, but increasingly deferred to their judgment on operational decisions. That's when the subtle changes began. Changes I initially dismissed as generational differences in management style. Board meetings that had once been scheduled around my availability were suddenly set during my off days. Financial reports came to me summarized rather than in full. When I raised questions about expenditures or new hires, I was assured everything was being handled and not to worry. "Mom, you've earned a break," Michael would say, his arm around my shoulders. "We've got this. Isn't that what you raised us to do?" It was hard to argue with that logic. Hadn't I spent decades preparing them to take over? Wasn't their independence a sign of my successful parenting and mentorship? so I retreated further, spending more time with my grandchildren and pursuing the hobbies James and I had always planned to enjoy in our retirement: pottery classes, community theater, the garden club I'd never had time for when building the business. The first real warning sign came during last year's holiday party. For 39 years, I had given a speech to our employees, thanking them for their contributions and presenting year-end bonuses. It was a tradition James had started, one that connected leadership with every level of our workforce. But as I arrived at the venue and checked the program, I noticed Michael was listed as giving the address. "Just thought we'd give you a break, Mom," Angela explained when I questioned it. "You always get so emotional during these speeches." Michael's prepared something really motivational. I sat through the evening feeling strangely displaced as Michael delivered a polished presentation about Hartwell's new era and modernizing for the next generation. He thanked me briefly for laying the groundwork for today's success, as if my 4 decades of leadership were merely preliminary to the real achievements now underway. That night, I pulled out the company bylaws and ownership documents, reassuring myself that I still held 51% of the shares. The remaining 49% were split equally among my 3 children, as James and I had planned. Legally, I remained in control, but increasingly, it felt like a technicality my children were working around rather than respecting. Yet nothing prepared me for what happened at this year's Christmas dinner, an annual tradition I had always hosted in my home until Michael and Rebecca insisted last year that their newly renovated house was more suitable for entertaining the whole family. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The roots of what happened at that Christmas dinner stretch back much further than my children's recent behavior. To understand the full picture, you need to know how Hartwell Custom Furniture became not just a business, but the cornerstone of our family's identity. James and I met at a trade school in 1975. He was studying woodworking after returning from Vietnam, determined to work with his hands creating beautiful things after years surrounded by destruction. I was taking night classes in bookkeeping, looking for a way to support myself after leaving a difficult first marriage. We were an unlikely pair, James with his quiet intensity and sawdust-covered flannel shirts, me with my practical pumps and careful ledgers, but we recognized in each other a shared determination to build something meaningful. Our first workshop was a converted garage with secondhand tools and a homemade drafting table. James created extraordinary pieces: rocking chairs with curves that seemed to defy the properties of wood, tables inlaid with intricate patterns that told stories, while I handled everything else. I found clients, negotiated prices, managed our meager finances, and often stained and finished pieces while James started on the next commission. Our big break came when a local doctor commissioned a complete dining set after seeing a coffee table James had built for his neighbor. The doctor's friends began ordering pieces, and within 3 years, we had enough work to lease a small workshop and hire our first employee, a gifted finisher named Ray, who stayed with us for 32 years until his retirement. Those early years were lean. We lived in a small apartment above the workshop, reinvesting every spare dollar back into the business. When Michael was born in 1981, I brought him to work in a bassinet beside my desk. Angela followed 18 months later, and Daniel 3 years after that. The children grew up understanding sacrifice and delayed gratification. There were no lavish family vacations or designer clothes, but there was pride in watching something grow from nothing. By 1990, Hartwell Custom Furniture had 15 employees and had moved to a converted warehouse in Milwaukee's 3rd Ward. We had developed a reputation for exceptional craftsmanship and design that justified our premium prices. James handled production and design, while I managed the business operations, marketing, and client relationships. We complemented each other perfectly, rarely disagreeing about the direction of the company because our strengths and passions were so clearly defined. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The children absorbed different aspects of the business as they grew. Michael was always drawn to the showroom, watching how I interacted with clients and learning to anticipate what would appeal to different customers. By 16, he could deliver a sales pitch that would charm even the most hesitant buyers. Angela shadowed me through accounting and operations, showing an aptitude for systems and efficiencies. And Daniel, my youngest, inherited his father's eye for design and proportion, spending hours in the workshop learning techniques from James and our master craftspeople. I remember one particular Sunday when Daniel was about 11, James found him in the workshop at 6 a.m., carefully trying to replicate a complicated dovetail joint using scraps from the previous day's production. Instead of sending him back to bed, James pulled up a stool and spent 3 hours teaching him the proper technique. That evening at dinner, Daniel proudly presented me with a small jewelry box. Its joints imperfect, but made with such care that I still keep it on my dresser today. When the children reached college age, James and I had extensive discussions about the future of the business. We believed strongly that they should choose their own paths rather than feeling obligated to join the family company. The business should serve the family, not the other way around, James would say. If they find their passion elsewhere, we'll have succeeded as parents even if we have to sell the company someday. Michael attended the University of Wisconsin for marketing. Angela went to Northwestern for business administration, and Daniel studied industrial design at RISD. We paid for their educations in full, no student loans, using the profits from the business we had sacrificed so much to build. It was an investment in their futures, whether those futures included Hartwell or not. James never pressured them to return, but I think he was quietly thrilled when each of them, after exploring other opportunities, chose to bring their talents back to the company. By the time of his death in 2008, all 3 children were working in the business, though I remained the primary decision-maker alongside James. His passing was sudden, a massive heart attack while inspecting lumber at a supplier's yard. One moment he was discussing the grain pattern of cherry boards, and the next, he was gone at just 58. The loss was devastating on every level: personal, emotional, and professional. James had been not only my husband and partner, but also the creative soul of Hartwell Custom Furniture. His designs and standards defined our brand. In the aftermath of his death, I faced both grief and a business crisis. Several major clients called with condolences, but also concerns about whether we could maintain quality without James. Our craftspeople looked to me for direction, uncertain about the future. The children were still finding their footing in their respective roles. That period revealed something in me I hadn't fully recognized before: a core of steel beneath my practical exterior. I assured clients that James had trained an exceptional team who shared his vision. I worked with our master craftspeople to document James's techniques and design principles. I took over financial negotiations that James had handled, discovering I had absorbed more than I realized from overhearing his conversations over decades. Within 6 months, we had not only stabilized but begun to grow again. I found unexpected strength in preserving James's legacy, determined that everything we had built together would continue to thrive. The children stepped up remarkably during this period, each taking on more responsibility as I navigated both the business and my grief. Perhaps that's why their recent behavior cut so deeply. The business they were now treating as exclusively their own had been built through decades of sacrifice, ingenuity, and persistence. Through years when I balanced colicky babies on my hip while calling vendors. Through seasons when James and I paid our employees but not ourselves. Through countless nights spent at the kitchen table worrying over cash flow and inventory decisions. They had inherited not just a successful company, but the fruits of a life's work, a legacy of craftsmanship, integrity, and family values that, seemed increasingly forgotten as they redecorated offices and reimagined branding that had stood the test of time. The first significant shift came about 3 years ago, shortly after we opened our 4th showroom in Madison. The expansion had been my idea. Market research showed strong potential in the university area with its influx of well-paid professors and administrators. I had personally secured the location, a beautifully restored historic building just off State Street that perfectly showcased our blend of traditional craftsmanship and contemporary design. The grand opening was a tremendous success. Local media covered the event, the mayor cut a ceremonial ribbon, and we booked nearly $100,000 in orders that first weekend. I was thrilled, especially since I had championed the expansion despite Michael's initial reservations about the investment required. At the celebratory dinner afterward, Michael raised his glass. "To Hartwell's expansion into new territory," he announced to our gathered staff and family. "This marks the beginning of our growth strategy for the next decade." I noticed the subtle shift in language immediately. Our growth strategy, rather than acknowledging my vision for the Madison location. When a local reporter asked about the expansion, Michael smoothly stepped in front of me. "We've been planning this strategic move for some time," he explained. "Our executive team identified Madison as an untapped market with the perfect demographic for our products." Later that night, back at our hotel, I mentioned the interaction to Michael. "You know, I developed the Madison expansion plan," I said carefully. "I'd appreciate if you'd acknowledge that when speaking to the press." His response caught me off guard. "Mom, no one wants to hear about a septuagenarian businesswoman. Customers and investors respond better to seeing the next generation at the helm. It's just optics." "Optics?" I repeated, startled by both the dismissal and the term. "Since when do we make decisions based on optics rather than truth?" Michael sighed in that patronizing way that had become increasingly familiar. "The business world has changed, Mom. Perception matters as much as reality now. We need to position Hartwell as forward-thinking, not traditional." The implication was clear. At 70, I had become a liability to the company's image rather than its driving force. A month later, I noticed Angela had hired a new financial controller without consulting me. When I stopped by his office to introduce myself, he seemed confused about my role. "I report directly to the CFO," he explained, referring to Angela by her recently self-designated title. "The organizational chart shows your position as advisory." Advisory? I had never approved such a change in our company structure. When I confronted Angela, she brushed it off as a simple misunderstanding. "It's just internal terminology, Mom," she assured me. "Everyone knows you're still in charge, but we need clear reporting lines for efficiency. You don't want to be bothered with day-to-day financial details anyway, right?" There was a kernel of truth there. I had been delegating more of the financial minutiae to focus on big-picture decisions and customer relationships, which had always been my strength. But there's a vast difference between delegating tasks and being systematically sidelined from decisions. Daniel's subtle shift was perhaps the most painful. He had always been my most sensitive child, the one who seemed to truly appreciate the heritage of craftsmanship his father had established. But after hiring several young designers from his alma mater, he began revamping our core product lines without seeking my input. When our signature Hartwell Heritage Collection, the traditional designs that had been our backbone for decades, was suddenly rebranded as Legacy Series and relegated to a small section of our showrooms, I felt a physical ache. These were the pieces James had designed, the furniture that had built our reputation. "We're not discontinuing anything," Daniel explained when I expressed my concern. "We're just giving prominence to designs that appeal to younger buyers with more contemporary tastes. The legacy pieces are still available for customers who prefer classic styles." The way he said classic, as if it were synonymous with outdated, stung more than he knew. These changes accelerated after I reduced my in-office schedule to 3 days a week. Important vendor meetings were increasingly scheduled on my off days. When I offered to come in anyway, I was told not to trouble myself, that they would handle it and brief me later. Those briefings became increasingly perfunctory, with details conspicuously omitted. I found myself learning about company decisions from employees rather than my children. Our master craftsman of 20 years mentioned a new production schedule that would rush our finishing process, something James had always insisted could not be hurried without compromising quality. One of our longtime salespeople asked me about a price increase on custom designs that I hadn't approved. The receptionist casually mentioned the company was considering relocating headquarters to a more prestigious address. Each time I raised these issues, my concerns were minimized. "It's just an exploratory discussion, Mom." Or, "We're only testing some adjustments to the process." Or my least favorite, "Business practices have evolved since your day." Since my day. As if my day had passed, rather than still being very much present. The most telling incident occurred during a quarterly board meeting about 18 months ago. I had prepared a detailed proposal for establishing an apprenticeship program to preserve our traditional woodworking techniques, skills that were becoming increasingly rare as older craftspeople retired. The program would partner with local, technical colleges to identify promising students, offering them part-time employment and training while they completed their education. "This represents a significant investment in our future," I explained, distributing the carefully prepared packets containing budget projections, curriculum outlines, and potential community grants that could offset costs. "It ensures the techniques that distinguish Hartwell pieces will continue for another generation." I was proud of the proposal, having spent weeks researching similar programs and consulting with both educational experts and our senior craftspeople. Instead of the engaged discussion I expected, my presentation was met with uncomfortable glances between my children. "We appreciate the thoroughness of your proposal, Mom," Michael finally said, using the formal tone he reserved for board meetings. "But we've actually been developing a different direction for production. Angela, would you share the automation presentation?" Angela smoothly opened her laptop and projected a sleek presentation about new computer-controlled routing and finishing. Systems that could streamline production, ensure consistency, and reduce labor costs. The technology would replace many of the handcrafted elements that had distinguished our furniture, standardizing production in ways James would have found abhorrent. "The market is moving toward faster delivery and lower price points," she explained. "This investment will position us to compete more effectively against larger manufacturers." I felt as if I'd been ambushed. "This directly contradicts our brand position," I objected. "Hartwell has always stood for handcraftsmanship and custom quality. These machines would make us just another furniture factory." "With all due respect," Daniel interjected, "we need to evolve. Customers say they value craftsmanship, but their purchasing decisions are driven primarily by price and delivery time." "Some customers, perhaps," I countered. "But not our customers. We've built a clientele that appreciates the difference and is willing to pay for it." The discussion continued in this vein, with my children presenting a united front against my objections. By meeting's end, no formal decision had been made, but the apprenticeship proposal was effectively tabled for further consideration, business speak for rejected. As I packed up my materials, I overheard Michael murmur to Angela, "This is exactly why we need to streamline the decision-making process." I drove home that day with an uncomfortable realization forming. My children weren't just taking increasing control of the company. They were systematically pushing me out of meaningful participation. The question was why, and what, if anything, I should do about it. As spring turned to summer that year, the distance between my understanding of Hartwell furniture and my children's vision grew increasingly apparent. At first, I tried to bridge the gap through collaboration and compromise. I began arriving at the office earlier on my scheduled days, making a point to check in with each department and remain visible. I suggested weekly family lunches to keep communication channels open, positioning these as casual opportunities to share ideas rather than formal meetings that might feel confrontational. Michael agreed to the lunches but frequently canceled at the last minute, citing important client meetings. Angela would attend, but spent most of the time answering emails on her phone or taking calls that couldn't wait. Only Daniel made a consistent effort to engage, though even he seemed distracted, his mind clearly on the design projects awaiting his return to the studio. Meanwhile, changes to the company accelerated. New staff were hired, mostly young professionals with corporate backgrounds rather than furniture experience. The workshop floor was reconfigured to accommodate the first pieces of automated equipment, despite no formal board approval for the transition. Our marketing materials underwent a complete redesign, emphasizing modern luxury and contemporary living, while photographs of our traditional pieces and craftspeople became increasingly scarce. Most concerning was a new financing arrangement Angela had secured with Crescent Capital, a private investment firm specializing in mid-sized family businesses. I learned about it only after the preliminary agreement had been signed, an agreement giving Crescent observer rights at board meetings in exchange for a substantial line of credit. "This is a significant governance change," I said when Angela finally briefed me on the arrangement. "It should have come to the full board for discussion before any documents were signed." "It's just a standard financing relationship," Angela replied, sliding the thick agreement across my desk. "Every growing company needs access to capital. This gives us flexibility without giving up any control." I took the document home that weekend and read every page, something I suspected Angela hadn't expected me to do. Buried in the legal language were provisions for Crescent to convert their debt to equity under certain conditions, including failure, to meet quarterly growth targets that seemed unrealistically aggressive. When I raised these concerns at our next board meeting, Angela dismissed them as highly unlikely scenarios that were standard in these agreements. Michael backed her position, suggesting I was being unnecessarily cautious. "We need to think bigger, Mom," he insisted. "Hartwell has potential to be a national brand, but we're still operating like a regional workshop." That regional workshop approach built a company that supports 36 families and generates consistent profits, I reminded him. Rapid expansion has risks that debt magnifies. The meeting ended in a stalemate, but I left with a growing certainty that my children were steering the company in a dangerous direction, leveraging our stable, profitable business to chase growth at any cost. That summer also brought changes in our family dynamics outside the business. Rebecca, Michael's wife, had always been politely distant toward me, but now she became the unofficial social director for family gatherings, invariably scheduling them when she knew I had other commitments or choosing venues that were difficult for me to access with my occasional hip pain. When I hosted Sunday dinner, as I had for decades, Rebecca would arrive with additional food she'd prepared, explaining sweetly that she knew everyone loved her special recipes and wanted to take some burden off me. The implication that I could no longer manage to properly feed my family was impossible to miss. Angela's husband, Thomas, a tax attorney who had always treated me with respect, began deferring to Michael on financial matters that came up in family conversations, even though my experience far exceeded my son's. And Daniel's partner, Jason, once my ally in preserving the company's artistic heritage, now enthusiastically described the exciting rebranding underway whenever we met. I felt increasingly isolated, not just from the business, but from my family as a whole. Friends my age had warned me about becoming invisible after 70, how society tends to look past older women regardless of their accomplishments or ongoing capabilities. But I never expected to experience this from my own children, whom I had raised to value wisdom and respect experience. The situation came to a head in September when I discovered, through a casual conversation with our longtime leather supplier, that the company had decided to switch to a cheaper, lower-quality material for our upholstered pieces. I was sorry to lose your business after 30 years, Carlos said when he called to check on a personal order I'd placed. But I understand businesses need to watch their bottom line. Shocked, I asked for details and learned that Michael had canceled our standing order 3 months earlier, after finding a supplier who could provide leather at nearly 40% lower cost. The samples they showed me weren't comparable to your usual standards, Carlo added. But your son said customers wouldn't notice the difference. I drove straight to our warehouse and examined the new leather inventory myself. The difference was immediately apparent. The grain was more processed, the hand feels stiffer, and the color less rich. This was exactly the kind of compromise James had steadfastly refused throughout his life, believing that quality materials were non-negotiable. When I confronted Michael in his office, his response left me speechless. Mom, we did a blind test with focus groups, and less than 10% could identify the premium leather versus the standard grade. We're saving over $200,000 annually with this change. Hartwell has never made decisions based on what customers might not notice, I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. We make decisions based on what we know represents true quality. Michael leaned back in his chair, James's chair, which he'd had reupholstered in black leather after moving into the executive office. That approach might have worked in a different era, he said with exaggerated patience. But today's market requires adaptability. Margins are tighter, competition is fiercer, and most consumers simply aren't willing to pay the premium for materials that don't deliver a noticeable difference in their experience. This isn't just about margins, I insisted. It's about integrity, about standing behind every piece that bears our family name. With all due respect, Michael replied, a phrase I'd come to recognize as prefacing something fundamentally disrespectful. The business needs to evolve beyond sentimentality. Dad's been gone 15 years, Mom. We can't keep running Hartwell like a shrine to his memory. The mention of James that way, as if my commitment to quality was merely widow's sentimentality rather than sound business principle, felt like a physical blow. I left without another word, driving aimlessly for nearly an hour before returning home. That evening, I called an old friend who had retired from her law practice but still maintained connections in the business community. Without sharing specifics that might betray family confidences, I explained my general concerns about being gradually excluded from company decisions despite maintaining majority ownership. Her advice was direct. Document everything. Review all company bylaws and shareholder agreements, and consider getting independent legal counsel who represents your interests specifically, not the company's. It felt extreme, lawyering up against my own children. But as I reflected on the accelerating changes and my diminishing influence, I realized I needed to protect not just my own interests, but the very soul of the company James and I had built. The next morning, I retrieved our original company documents from my home safe, paperwork I hadn't reviewed in years, trusting that our family business would be governed by mutual respect rather than legal technicalities. It was time to understand exactly where I stood. The Christmas season had always been special for Hartwell Custom Furniture. Our showrooms transformed with tasteful decorations that complemented our pieces rather than overwhelming them. We hosted evening events for loyal customers, serving mulled wine and showcasing the craftsmanship that made our furniture heirloom quality. For decades, I had personally selected which pieces would receive holiday discounts, balancing business needs with the genuine desire to help families create homes where memories would be made. This year was different. Without consulting me, Michael had hired an outside marketing firm that specialized in holiday retail optimization. Our showrooms now blazed with commercial decorations that made them look like department stores. Garish signs advertised, "Biggest sale ever," and "Limited time offers." Salespeople were given aggressive targets and scripts that emphasized closing deals quickly rather than building relationships. I barely recognized the business we had built. The changes went beyond seasonal marketing. They represented a fundamental shift in values that broke my heart. 2 weeks before Christmas, I requested financial reports I hadn't received on schedule. Angela's response came via email rather than in person, despite our offices being 30 feet apart. We're transitioning to a new reporting system. The Q4 numbers are still being migrated. I'll get you a simplified summary before the holidays. Simplified. Summary. As if I couldn't understand the full financial picture of the company I had managed for 40 years. That same day, Daniel avoided a conversation about material substitutions in his new designs by claiming he was late for an important client meeting. A meeting I later discovered didn't exist. These small deceptions accumulated like snowflakes, eventually forming an impenetrable drift between me and the children I had raised to value honesty above all else. My review of the company documents had revealed something crucial. While I maintained 51% ownership, a bylaw amendment passed 5 years earlier, when I had been distracted by my own health crisis, a heart valve replacement, required a supermajority of 75% for certain key decisions, including removal of officers. This meant that while I had a controlling interest, I couldn't unilaterally remove my children from their positions without at least one of them siding with me. What troubled me more than this legal technicality was realizing they had deliberately created this protection when I was vulnerable, effectively limiting my authority while I was focused on recovery. It suggested a level of calculation I found difficult to reconcile with the children I thought I knew. Which brings me to that Christmas dinner at Michael and Rebecca's house, the culmination of a year of growing tensions and diminishing respect. Their home was showcased that evening in all its calculated perfection. The massive Tudor revival in Milwaukee's most exclusive suburb had been featured in a regional design magazine earlier that year. With its soaring ceilings, custom millwork, ironically not crafted by Hartwell, and expansive windows overlooking the private lake, it broadcast success and status with every detail. The table was set immaculately. Rebecca had hired a professional stylist for the occasion, something she mentioned repeatedly during cocktails. 14 places were arranged around the custom-made mahogany dining table, one of the last pieces James had designed before his death. I had given it to them as a housewarming gift 3 years earlier, a gesture that felt increasingly naive as I observed how they had built a lifestyle that seemed designed to eclipse the modest foundation from which it grew. When Michael directed me to the children's table, I initially thought he was joking. The look we exchanged confirmed he was not. Something in me, perhaps the accumulated weight of 1,000 small humiliations, finally broke through my practiced composure. "I see," I said, my voice steady despite the anger rising within me. "And what exactly will you be discussing at the main table that I shouldn't hear?" An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Angela glanced at Michael, a silent communication passing between them. Daniel studied his shoes, unwilling to meet my eyes. "It's just logistics, Mom," Michael finally answered. "The table only seats 12 comfortably, and with Thomas's parents visiting and Jason's sister in town, we had to make adjustments. Adjustments that somehow resulted in seating the founder of the company that pays for this house at the children's table," I observed. Rebecca stepped forward, her smile tight. "Catherine, we certainly didn't mean to offend. We thought you'd enjoy spending time with the grandchildren. You're always saying how you don't get enough time with them." "Don't," I said quietly. "Don't pretend this is about my convenience or preference." I looked around at the faces of my family, my children and their spouses, my 5 grandchildren watching wide-eyed from the kitchen doorway. Even Thomas's parents, who had always treated me with a deference that bordered on discomfort. In that moment, I made a decision that had been building for months. "I think I'll pass on dinner tonight," I said, reaching for my coat. "I suddenly find my appetite has disappeared." "Mom, don't be dramatic," Angela said, her tone carrying the same dismissive quality she'd been using at the office. "It's Christmas Eve." "Yes, it is," I agreed. "A time for family, for gratitude, for remembering what matters. Apparently, we have very different ideas about what that means. As I moved toward the door, Daniel finally spoke. "Mom, please stay. We'll rearrange the seating." "This isn't about seating, Daniel," I replied gently, for he had always been the most sensitive to emotional undercurrents. "This is about respect, something that's been in short supply lately, both at home and at the company." Michael's expression hardened. "If you're referring to the business decisions we've made, those are about modernizing a company that was falling behind its competitors. Sometimes progress requires difficult changes." I buttoned my coat slowly, choosing my words with care. Progress built on disrespect isn't progress at all, it's just movement. The drive home through Milwaukee's snowy streets gave me time to reflect on what had just occurred and what needed to happen next. The children's table incident was merely a physical manifestation of how they had been treating me for months, as an afterthought, a relic, someone to be managed rather than respected. By the time I reached my house, the same modest 4-bedroom where we had raised our family, which I had kept after James's death, despite suggestions from Michael that I upgrade, I had formed a clear resolution. The time for gentle corrections and hopeful patience had passed. If my children wanted to learn about business leadership, I would give them a lesson they wouldn't forget. Christmas Day passed quietly. My children called with stiff apologies that never quite acknowledged the real issue. I accepted them graciously, assuring everyone that we would talk more after the holidays. I spent the day reviewing company documents, making notes, and placing several calls to old contacts in the industry, people who had known James and me since the beginning, who understood what Hartwell Custom Furniture truly represented. On December 26th, while most businesses remained closed for the extended holiday, I drove to our corporate office, using my key to enter the quiet building. For the next 6 hours, I systematically went through financial records, contracts, customer data, and production reports, building a comprehensive picture of exactly what had been happening while I had been gradually sidelined. What I discovered confirmed my worst fears, but also gave me the leverage I needed. The aggressive expansion funded by Crescent Capital was already showing signs of strain. Cash flow projections were concerning, customer complaints about quality had increased dramatically, and several key artisans had resigned in recent months, information that had been carefully kept from me. Most significantly, I found documentation of a preliminary conversation with a national furniture conglomerate about a potential acquisition of Hartwell. Discussions undertaken without board approval and certainly without my knowledge. My children had been exploring selling the company out from under me, using the financial pressure from their risky expansion to justify the move. As I sat in my office, technically still my office, though it had been subtly transformed with new furnishings, and my personal items relocated to less prominent positions, I felt an odd sense of calm descend. The path forward was suddenly clear. If my children wanted to treat the company as their own, they would first need to understand who really controlled Hartwell's future. I gathered the essential documents I'd need, locked the building, and drove home through the winter darkness, a plan forming with each passing mile. The next board meeting was scheduled for January 5th, the perfect opportunity to deliver some long overdue clarity about ownership, authority, and consequences. My children had seated me at the kids' table. They were about to learn just how costly that mistake would be. The week between Christmas and New Year's passed in a strange limbo. My children made obligatory calls, their conversations strained with unaddressed tension. I maintained a pleasant demeanor, deflecting questions about when we might properly celebrate the holiday together, with vague references to my busy schedule. "I've got some year-end matters to handle," I told Michael when he suggested a new Year's Day gathering at his home. "Business things that can't wait. You understand how that is?" He seemed relieved by my apparent return to normalcy, interpreting my calm as surrender rather than strategy. That misconception would serve me well in the days ahead. I spent that week methodically building my case. My first call was to Eleanor Simmons, an attorney who had been a close friend since our children attended the same elementary school. Now, a senior partner at a prestigious law firm, Eleanor specialized in corporate governance and family business disputes. "This won't be easy, Kathy," she warned after I explained the situation. "Family business conflicts are among the most emotional cases I handle. Are you prepared for how your children might react?" "I'm prepared for them to be angry," I replied. "What I'm not prepared to do is watch them dismantle everything James and I built because they've forgotten the principles that made it successful in the first place." Eleanor helped me organize the documentation I'd gathered and develop a strategic approach for the upcoming board meeting. We identified several key leverage points: decisions made without proper authority, potential breaches of fiduciary duty, and, most importantly, violations of specific clauses in our company bylaws that preserved certain powers exclusively for the majority shareholder. My next call was to Raymond Hoffman, who had served as our bank's relationship manager for over 20 years before his retirement. Raymond had helped finance our first workshop expansion and had stood by us during economic downturns when other banks were calling in loans. "This Crescent Capital agreement is concerning," he said after reviewing the documents I'd emailed him. "The conversion terms heavily favor the lender, and these growth targets, in the current economic climate, who projected these numbers?" "My daughter," I replied. "She has an MBA from Northwestern and considers my financial conservatism outdated." Raymond's laugh held no humor. "I've seen enough innovative financing arrangements to recognize when someone's placed a bet they can't cover. These terms could allow Crescent to claim nearly 30% of your company if growth targets aren't met for 2 consecutive quarters." That conversation confirmed what I had suspected. Angela's financial modernization had placed the company in a vulnerable position that my children either didn't understand or had deliberately concealed from me. My final and perhaps most important call was to Martin Cervantes, who had worked alongside James for 15 years before becoming our master craftsman. Martin had trained dozens of our artisans, maintaining the exceptional standards that differentiated Hartwell pieces from mass-produced furniture. He had reluctantly retired 6 months earlier, though I now suspected his departure might not have been entirely voluntary. "I've been waiting for your call, Mrs. H," he said, his voice carrying the slight accent that remained from his childhood in Mexico. "I wondered how long it would take you to see what was happening." Over the next hour, Martin detailed how production standards had been systematically compromised, traditional techniques abandoned for faster methods, and quality concerns dismissed by the young bosses who prioritized output over craftsmanship. When I tried to explain why certain processes couldn't be rushed, Mr. Michael told me we weren't building museum pieces, just furniture that needed to ship on schedule, Martin recalled, the hurt still evident in his voice. That's when I knew it was time to go. "Would you consider coming back?" I asked. "If things were different?" His pause carried weight. "For you and Mr. James's memory? Yes, but only if the company returned to what it was meant to be." By New Year's Eve, I had assembled everything I needed: legal documentation, financial analysis, testimony from key personnel, and a clear vision for reclaiming Hartwell's future. I celebrated the turning of the year alone in my home office, raising a glass of James's favorite bourbon to the photograph of us on our 30th anniversary, the last one we would celebrate together. "I'm fixing it, my love," I whispered to his smiling image. "I promise." The January 5th board meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. in our company conference room. I arrived at 8:15, deliberately early, and asked our receptionist to arrange the seating differently than usual. Instead of my customary place in the middle of the table, a position my children had gradually reinterpreted as ceremonial rather than authoritative, I instructed her to place me at the head, with copies of the bound presentation I had prepared, at each place. Angela arrived first, her attention focused on her phone as always. She glanced up, registering the changed seating arrangement with raised eyebrows, but no comment. Michael and Daniel entered together moments later, engaged in discussion about a potential new client. "Good morning," I said pleasantly when they had taken their seats. "Before we begin the regular agenda, I have several items that require immediate attention." Michael checked his watch. "We have a pretty full schedule today, Mom. Perhaps your items could be addressed under other business at the end." "No," I replied simply. "They cannot." Something in my tone silenced further objections. I opened my folder and began. Over the past year, several significant decisions have been made regarding Hartwell Custom Furniture without proper authorization from the board or the majority shareholder, that being me, with 51% ownership. I looked each of my children in the eye, one by one. These decisions have placed the company in a precarious financial position, compromised our product quality, and violated both our written bylaws and the values upon which this company was founded. Angela's posture stiffened. "Mom, if this is about the Crescent Capital arrangement—" "Among other things, yes," I interrupted, sliding copies of the loan documents across the table. "This financing agreement contains conversion provisions that potentially jeopardize family control of Hartwell. It was executed without my knowledge or approval, which constitutes a clear violation of Section 4.3 of our bylaws, requiring majority shareholder approval for any debt instrument with equity." "Conversion features." Michael leaned forward. "That funding was essential for our expansion strategy, which you've consistently resisted. Sometimes leadership means making difficult decisions when others can't see the bigger picture. Leadership also requires transparency and honesty," I countered, my voice steady, "neither of which were demonstrated when you began preliminary acquisition discussions with national home brands." The shocked expressions on Daniel's and Angela's faces told me that this particular plan hadn't been shared with the entire sibling group. "Interesting. Those were exploratory conversations," Michael said carefully. "Nothing formal." "Exploratory conversations that violated Section 7.1 of our shareholder agreement, which prohibits any discussion of company sale without unanimous board consent," I noted, tapping the relevant page in my presentation. "I've prepared a comprehensive assessment of governance violations over the past 18 months. Eleanor Simmons, whom I've retained as my personal counsel, has identified 12 separate instances where company bylaws were disregarded." "You hired a lawyer?" Daniel asked, his voice small. "Against us?" "I hired a lawyer to protect what your father and I spent 40 years building," I corrected gently, "something that became necessary when my own children decided my input was no longer valuable, a sentiment that culminated in seating me at the children's table for Christmas dinner." Angela had the grace to look embarrassed, but Michael's expression hardened. "This is exactly why we've had to work around you, Mom. You take every business decision personally. You're so fixated on preserving Dad's legacy that you can't see when change is necessary for survival." "On the contrary," I replied, "I understand change better than you think. What I don't accept is betrayal of core values under the guise of progress." I slid another document forward. "This is a quality assessment from 3 independent furniture experts who examined recent Hartwell pieces against those from 5 and 10 years ago. Their findings confirm a significant decline in craftsmanship, materials, and durability, the very attributes that justify our premium pricing." Daniel fidgeted uncomfortably. "We've had to make some adjustments to remain competitive." "You've made compromises that undermine our brand identity," I corrected. "And in doing so, you've accelerated a race to the bottom that we can never win against larger manufacturers with economies of scale we'll never achieve." I took a deep breath, centering myself for what came next. Effective immediately, I am exercising my authority as majority shareholder and CEO to make the following changes. Michael, you are removed as president and reassigned as vice president of sales, reporting directly to me. Angela, you are removed as CFO. The board will conduct a search for an experienced financial officer from outside the company. Daniel, you will continue as design director but with oversight from a standards committee that I will chair. The stunned silence that followed was broken by Michael's incredulous laugh. You can't be serious. You can't just demote us like we're employees. We're directors of this company. You're children. I'm absolutely serious, I replied calmly. And while I cannot remove you from the board without a 75% vote, I can reassign operational responsibilities as CEO. Should you choose to challenge these changes, Eleanor has prepared documentation for a derivative lawsuit based on the governance violations I've identified. Angela, always the quickest to assess financial realities, paled visibly. A lawsuit would damage the company value significantly. Yes, I agreed. It would, which is why I sincerely hope you'll accept these changes as necessary course corrections rather than punitive measures. Despite recent events, I believe each of you brings valuable skills to Hartwell. But those skills must be exercised within a framework of integrity and respect for what makes this company special. Michael stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. This is nothing but a power play from someone who can't accept that her time has passed. If you do this, you're destroying everything we've worked to build. I met his angry gaze steadily. No, Michael, I'm saving what your father and I built before your ambition dismantles it completely. The choice now is yours. Adapt to these changes and help rebuild Hartwell's reputation for excellence, or fight me and risk everything in a public legal battle that will benefit no one except our competitors. The aftermath of the board meeting was everything I had anticipated, and yet somehow worse than I had imagined. Michael stormed out, slamming the door with enough force to rattle the framed photographs of James that still lined our conference room wall. Angela remained, her financial mind already calculating the implications of a protracted legal battle versus accepting my terms. Daniel sat motionless, tears welling in his eyes, caught between siblings and parent in a conflict he had never wanted. You could have approached this differently, Angela finally said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. You didn't have to ambush us. The way you approached the Crescent Capital deal? Or the quality compromises? Or the acquisition talks? I countered. When exactly did any of you consult me on those decisions? She had no answer for that. I'll review your documentation, she said after a moment, rising and gathering the materials I had presented. We should discuss this further when everyone is calmer. After she departed, only Daniel and I remained in the suddenly cavernous conference room. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken words. I didn't know about the acquisition discussions, he finally offered. Michael said we needed to explore all options to fund the expansion properly, but he never mentioned selling. Would you have supported it if he had? I asked gently. Daniel ran his hands through his hair, James's gesture, so familiar it made my heart ache. I don't know. Things have been moving so fast lately. The new designs, the production changes. Sometimes it feels like we're just running to keep up with some invisible competition. That's exactly the problem, I said. We built this company by setting our own pace, not chasing others. Your father understood that quality creates its own market. But the world has changed, Mom, Daniel sighed. People want things faster, cheaper. Some people do, I acknowledged. But those aren't our customers. Never have been. He nodded slowly, his designer's eye drifting to the presentation I had prepared. Meticulous, detailed, professional. The work of someone still very much in command of her faculties and business acumen. I underestimated you, he admitted. We all did. Yes, I agreed without rancor. You did. The next 2 weeks were among the most difficult in Hartwell's history. Michael refused to accept his reassignment and took a leave of absence, his office sitting empty while rumors circulated among staff. Angela continued working, but with a chilly formality that made everyday interactions painful. Daniel, caught in the middle, tried to maintain relationships with both sides, but was clearly stressed by the fractured family dynamics. The tension extended beyond our corporate walls. Rebecca canceled a planned grandchildren's visit without explanation. Thomas became the designated intermediary for necessary family communications. Friends and business associates who had known us for years awkwardly avoided mentioning the obvious rift. I maintained a steady presence at the office, working full days for the first time in years. I met with department heads, reviewed pending orders, and began interviewing potential CFO candidates. Externally, I projected confidence and clarity. Privately, I questioned myself in the dark hours before dawn. Had I gone too far? Was there a less confrontational approach that might have preserved both the company and my relationship with my children? 17 days after the board meeting, the crisis deepened. I arrived at the office to find Martin Cervantes, our former master craftsman, waiting in the lobby. "Mrs. H," he said, rising quickly. "I needed to speak with you right away." His expression was grave enough that I ushered him directly to my office, closing the door for privacy. "Michael came to see me yesterday," Martin explained. "He wanted me to sign a statement saying that the quality standards at Hartwell have remained consistent over the past 5 years. When I refused, he suggested that my retirement package could be reevaluated if I wasn't a team player. The implicit threat against a man who had dedicated 2 decades to our company shocked me. "Did he put any of this in writing?" "No," Martin replied, "but he left this." He placed a document on my desk, a prepared statement with a signature line, attesting that production changes had not affected quality and that any claims to the contrary were exaggerated. I felt a cold anger building as I scanned the document. "Thank you for bringing this to me, Martin. I'll handle it." After he left, I sat motionless at my desk, staring at the statement Michael had attempted to coerce. This crossed a line from family disagreement into potential legal misconduct. I was contemplating my next move when my office phone rang. It was Linda, our receptionist. "Mrs. Hartwell, I have Jonathan Davis from Crescent Capital Holding. He says it's urgent." My stomach tightened. "Put him through." Jonathan Davis had been Angela's primary contact at Crescent, a smooth-talking financial type with carefully cultivated casualness that masked a shark-like business instinct. "Mrs. Hartwell," he greeted me with forced warmth. "I've been hoping to connect with you. We seem to be experiencing some confusion regarding Hartwell's strategic direction." "What confusion might that be, Mr. Davis?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "Well," he continued, "when we structured our financing arrangement, it was with the understanding that Hartwell was committed to an aggressive growth strategy. Recent information suggests there may be a shift in leadership vision." Translation: Michael or Angela had informed him of our power struggle. "Our commitment is to sustainable growth that maintains our quality standards," I replied carefully. "Any arrangement made with Crescent will be honored according to its legal terms." "I'm glad to hear that," Davis said, "because those terms include maintaining agreed-upon growth trajectories. A significant deviation could trigger certain protective provisions in our agreement." The threat was barely veiled. "I'm aware of all provisions in the agreement, Mr. Davis, though I find it interesting that Crescent seems so concerned about a routine management restructuring." His pause told me I'd struck a nerve. "We simply want to ensure our investment is protected. Perhaps we should schedule a meeting with all key decision-makers present." "I'll have my assistant contact you," I replied, ending the call before he could press further. No sooner had I hung up than Daniel appeared in my doorway, his expression troubled. "Mom, we need to talk. Michael's called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning." "On what authority?" I asked, though I suspected the answer. "He's invoking Section 3.7, the provision for emergency meetings called by any 2 directors when the company faces imminent financial risk." Angela's co-signed the notice. A technical maneuver, but a legitimate one under our bylaws. "And what imminent risk are they claiming?" Daniel shifted uncomfortably. They're saying your actions have triggered a potential default under the Crescent Agreement, that your intervention is threatening the company's financial stability. The coordinated timing between Davis's call and this meeting was too perfect to be coincidental. Michael and Angela had clearly been strategizing with Crescent, positioning me as the threat to the company's future rather than their own mismanagement. Will you attend? I asked Daniel directly. He met my eyes, torment evident in his expression. I have to, Mom. I'm still a director. But I wanted you to know before you received the official notice. I nodded, appreciating his small act of loyalty. Thank you. After Daniel left, I sat alone in my office, considering the rapidly escalating situation. What had begun as a family power struggle was evolving into something more complex and potentially damaging. Crescent Capital had clearly identified an opportunity in our family discord, likely seeing a path to convert their debt to equity sooner than planned. This realization brought with it an unexpected clarity. While I had been focused on the emotional betrayal of my children's actions, I had underestimated the external forces that might exploit our vulnerability. The threat wasn't just to my leadership or James's legacy, it was to the continued independence of Hartwell itself. I reached for the phone and dialed Eleanor Simmons. It's escalating, I told her without preamble. I need everything you have on Crescent Capital's other investments, particularly cases where they've converted debt to equity following management disputes. I'll put my team on it immediately, Eleanor replied. But Kathy, you should prepare yourself. Once these situations involve outside financial interests, they can spiral beyond family control very quickly. After we hung up, I unlocked the bottom drawer of my desk, the one that still contained James's old leather portfolio. Inside was a sealed envelope he had given me years ago, marked, "Open only in case of genuine threat to Hartwell's future." For 15 years, I had honored his request to leave it sealed, never quite facing a crisis that seemed to meet that threshold. Now, with Crescent circling and my children potentially aligning with outside interests against the company's founding principles, I carefully broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter in James's distinctive script, along with several legal documents I didn't immediately recognize. The letter began simply, "My dearest Kathy, if you're reading this, Hartwell faces a crossroads I've long feared might someday come. The documents enclosed represent my attempt to protect what we've built, should the worst occur. What matters isn't the business itself, but the values it represents. When faced with the choice between preserving the name and preserving the principles behind it, always choose principles. With all my love and confidence in your judgment, James beneath his signature was a postscript. C. Joseph Hartwell, no relation, Sterling and Associates, regarding the Hartwell family trust provisions." I examined the accompanying documents, my hands trembling slightly as I began to understand what James had arranged years ago. A contingency plan I never knew existed, designed to protect Hartwell's legacy from the very scenario now unfolding. The emergency board meeting would happen tomorrow, but tonight, I had a different appointment to keep, one that might change everything about this confrontation with my children. The offices of Sterling and Associates occupied the 14th floor of a downtown Milwaukee high-rise, with views overlooking the lake. The reception area spoke of old money and discretion, dark wood paneling, oil paintings of Wisconsin landscapes, furniture that had been selected for quality rather than fashion. It reminded me, somewhat ironically, of our original Hartwell showroom before my children's modernization efforts. Joseph Hartwell, indeed no relation, as James's note had specified, was a man in his 60s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He greeted me with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades managing other people's private affairs. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, extending his hand. "I've been expecting you, though I confess not for many years now." He led me to a conference room where a folder bearing my name already waited on the polished table. Your husband established the Hartwell Legacy Trust with our firm 17 years ago, he explained, opening the folder to reveal documents far more extensive than the summary James had left me. He was quite specific about the circumstances under which you might contact us. He never told me about any of this, I admitted. Joseph nodded as if this was expected. Mr. Hartwell wanted to avoid placing you in a difficult position with your children. He believed that knowledge of these arrangements might complicate family dynamics unnecessarily. That sounds like James, I said softly. Always trying to protect everyone's feelings, even from beyond the grave. Joseph allowed a small smile before continuing. The trust was designed with several triggering conditions, primarily centered around protection of the company's founding principles. Based on the situation you described on the phone, I believe we've reached the threshold for activation. He slid several documents toward me, each flagged with colored tabs for signature. As I began reviewing them, the full scope of James's foresight became clear. The Hartwell Legacy Trust owned significant assets I hadn't known existed, patents for specific furniture-making techniques James had developed, the original building where we'd established our first workshop, which we'd moved from but apparently James had purchased privately rather than selling, and most surprisingly, a separate corporate entity called Original Hartwell Designs that held the intellectual property rights to James's most iconic furniture collections. Your husband was quite strategic, Joseph explained. He structured this to ensure that the Hartwell name and legacy couldn't be compromised, regardless of what happened to the main company. If certain conditions are met, which I believe they now have been, the trust can exercise these rights to protect the original standards of craftsmanship. What exactly does that mean in practical terms? I asked, trying to absorb the implications. It means, Joseph said carefully, that if Hartwell Custom Furniture deviates from its established quality standards or faces acquisition by entities that would compromise those standards, the trust can revoke the company's rights to produce James Hartwell's original designs and manufacturing techniques. I sat back, stunned by the elegance of this arrangement. James had created a failsafe that couldn't prevent the company from being sold or changed, but would ensure that any such changes would come at the cost of losing the very designs and techniques that made Hartwell furniture distinctive. These are the company's most profitable product lines, I realized aloud. Yes, Joseph confirmed. Your husband was quite clear that any potential acquirer should understand exactly what they would and wouldn't be purchasing. By the time I left Sterling & Associates 2 hours later, I had signed the necessary documents to activate the trust provisions. Joseph had prepared a formal notification for the company, which would be delivered to all board members before tomorrow's emergency meeting. I drove home through the darkening winter afternoon, my mind racing with new possibilities. James's arrangements had changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. My children and Crescent Capital had been operating under the assumption that the company's assets, including its most valuable intellectual property, were all contained within Hartwell Custom Furniture, Inc. They were wrong. When I arrived home, I found Michael's car in my driveway, an unexpected development. He was sitting on my porch despite the January cold, his breath visible in the frosty air. "We need to talk," he said as I approached. His tone lacked the anger of our last encounter, replaced by something that sounded almost like worry. Inside, he declined my offer of coffee, remaining standing as if this would be a brief conversation. "I spoke with Crescent Capital today," he began without preamble. "They're pushing for immediate changes to our management structure, changes that would effectively remove you from any operational role." "I'm not surprised," I replied calmly, setting my bag on the kitchen counter. "They see an opportunity in our family disagreement." Michael paced across my kitchen, the same kitchen where he'd done homework while I balanced the company books, where James had sketched new designs at the table while we discussed cash flow projections over late-night cups of tea. "This isn't what I wanted," he said, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "I just wanted the company to grow, to reach its potential. You've been so resistant to change, so unwilling to trust our judgment, and you've been so determined to remake everything without understanding what made it valuable in the first place," I interrupted. "Did it ever occur to you that my resistance came from experience rather than stubbornness?" He stopped pacing, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Angela found something today when she was reviewing the original incorporation. Documents. Something about intellectual property ownership that doesn't make sense. So they were already discovering discrepancies. The trust documentation would be arriving in the morning, but I saw no reason to delay the inevitable. Your father established a separate trust years ago," I explained. "It holds the rights to his original designs and manufacturing techniques, rights that can be revoked if the company deviates from its founding standards of quality." Michael stared at me, momentarily speechless. That would undermine everything. "The Heritage Collection alone accounts for almost 40% of our revenue." "Yes," I agreed. James understood the value of his work. He also understood that some things are worth protecting, even from his own children's ambitions. "You knew about this all along?" His accusation carried a hint of the old anger. "No, I only discovered it today myself. Your father kept it from me to avoid exactly this kind of confrontation." I moved to the kitchen table and sat down, suddenly feeling the weight of the day. "Michael, please sit. This standing confrontation isn't necessary." After a moment's hesitation, he joined me at the table where our family had shared thousands of meals over the decades. "We're at a crossroads," I continued. "Tomorrow's board meeting can go one of two ways. You and Angela can continue your alliance with Crescent Capital, attempting to paint me as the obstacle to progress. If you do, I'll be forced to activate the trust provisions fully, which will leave Hartwell Custom Furniture without its most valuable assets." Michael's business mind quickly grasped the implications, making any acquisition far less attractive. "Precisely. Or," I continued, "we can use this moment to reset our family's relationship to the business, to find a path forward that respects both innovation and tradition." "And what would that look like?" he asked, skepticism evident in his tone. "It would start with honesty. With acknowledging that your father and I built something of value that deserves respect, not just renovation. It would include a genuine commitment to quality that can't be compromised for short-term gain." I leaned forward, meeting his eyes directly. "And it would require you to understand that growth that sacrifices our core identity isn't growth at all. It's surrender." Michael was silent for a long moment, his expression shifting through calculations and realizations I could almost track. Finally, he asked, "And our roles? Would you really demote your own children?" "I would reassign them to positions that match their talents while respecting the company's needs," I corrected. "Your sales skills are exceptional, Michael, but leadership requires more than ambition and charisma. It requires wisdom about what to preserve and what to change." He stood again, moving to the window that overlooked the backyard where he and his siblings had played as children. The yard where James had built them a treehouse on weekends between furniture commissions, where family picnics had celebrated company milestones. "I need to talk to Angela and Daniel," he said finally, "before tomorrow's meeting." "I think that's wise," I agreed. "And Michael, whatever you decide, remember that this is about more than business. It's about family and legacy and values that should transcend profit margins." After he left, I called Eleanor to update her on both the trust revelation and Michael's unexpected visit. She listened carefully, then offered her assessment. "The trust changes everything, Kathy. It gives you leverage they didn't anticipate. But be prepared. Tomorrow will still be difficult. Family conflicts like this leave wounds that take years to heal, regardless of the business outcome." I knew she was right. Whatever happened at tomorrow's meeting would alter our family dynamics permanently. The question wasn't whether there would be pain, but whether something valuable could be preserved through it. Both the company James and I had built and the family we had loved more than any business success. That night, I slept fitfully, dreaming. Of James and the early days of our marriage, when possibilities seemed endless and complications manageable. In those dreams, he repeated what he had often told me in life. Quality isn't about perfection, Kathy. It's about integrity, making something exactly as good as you claim it to be. No more, no less. I woke before dawn with his words echoing. In my mind, understanding suddenly that they applied not just to furniture but to family relationships as well. The quality of our connections would be determined by their integrity, their honesty, their consistency between word and action, their resilience under pressure. As I dressed for the board meeting, selecting a simple navy suit that had been my standard business attire for years, I felt a calm certainty about the path ahead. Whatever my children decided, I knew what I had to do to honor both James's legacy and my own values. The future of Hartwell Custom Furniture would be determined today. But more importantly, so would the character of the Hartwell family itself. The company conference room felt charged with tension as I arrived for the emergency board meeting. I had deliberately come early, taking my place at the head of the table with Eleanor Simmons seated beside me, her presence making it clear that legal representation was now part of our family dynamics. Joseph Hartwell from Sterling and Associates had delivered the trust documentation as promised. Identical folders sat at each board member's place, their contents about to reshape our conversation completely. Angela arrived first, her usual confident stride faltering slightly when she saw Eleanor. She had brought her own attorney, a young man with an aggressive tie and an expression that suggested he was eager to prove himself. "Mom," she acknowledged tersely, taking her seat without further greeting. Daniel came next, alone and visibly uncomfortable. He nodded to me with an uncertain smile before sitting as far from Angela as the table would allow. Michael entered last, and to my surprise, without legal representation. His expression was unreadable as he surveyed the room, noting Eleanor's presence and the conspicuous folders. "I see you've come prepared," he remarked. "As have you, I imagine," I replied evenly. Once everyone was seated, Michael cleared his throat. "Before we begin the official meeting, I'd like to request a brief family discussion, without counsel present." Eleanor glanced at me questioningly. I considered for a moment, then nodded. 15 minutes. Then we proceed formally. After the attorneys stepped out, an uncomfortable silence descended. Finally, Michael spoke. "I talked with Angela and Daniel last night. We reviewed the trust documents that were delivered this morning." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Dad was thorough in his arrangements. He valued what we built," I said simply. "The question is whether what we've built is still what he valued," Angela interjected, her tone challenging despite the legal bombshell she now understood. "That's exactly the question," I agreed. "And the trust provides a clear answer. If Hartwell Furniture abandons its commitment to quality craftsmanship for expedient growth, it loses the very designs that define its identity." Daniel, who had remained silent until now, leaned forward. "I reviewed the specific quality standards outlined in the trust. They're not unreasonable. They're exactly what we always claimed to deliver in our marketing materials." I felt a flicker of hope at his observation. Daniel had always understood the artistic integrity of our work, even as he explored contemporary expressions of it. Michael exchanged glances with Angela before continuing. "We've discussed our options. Fighting the trust provisions would be costly, time-consuming, and ultimately destructive to the company we all care about. And likely unsuccessful," Angela added pragmatically. "So where does that leave us?" I asked, watching their faces carefully. Michael took a deep breath. "It leaves us needing to find a compromise, one that allows for necessary evolution while preserving the standards that made Hartwell successful in the first place." It wasn't a surrender exactly, but it was an acknowledgement that the battle lines had shifted, and with them, the possibility of resolution. The compromise that emerged from that tense board meeting set Hartwell Custom Furniture on a new path. Or, perhaps more accurately, returned it to its original one with contemporary adaptations. The formal agreement took 3 weeks to finalize, with attorneys on all sides crafting language that protected both family relationships and business interests. In essence, we created a dual-track business model. The Heritage Collection, featuring James's original designs and traditional craftsmanship, would remain untouched by modernization efforts, preserving the quality standards that had built our reputation. Meanwhile, a new contemporary line would allow for more experimentation with materials, techniques, and price points, but would be marketed separately with different branding that wouldn't dilute the premium Hartwell name. Michael remained in leadership, but with the title of president rather than CEO, a position I retained for the transition period we established. Angela continued as financial director, but with oversight from an experienced outside CFO who brought valuable perspective from other family businesses that had navigated similar challenges. Daniel found renewed creative energy in balancing tradition and innovation, developing a mentorship program with Martin Cervantes that preserved traditional techniques while exploring their application to contemporary designs. The Crescent Capital situation required delicate handling. Once they understood the trust provisions, their aggressive stance softened considerably. With legal counsel present, we renegotiated terms that maintained their investment but removed the punitive conversion provisions that had created vulnerability. Their observer role at board meetings was eliminated entirely. These structural changes were important, but the deeper healing took more time and more honest conversation than our family had engaged in for years. I began meeting individually, with each of my children, outside the office in neutral settings where we could speak as family rather than business associates. These conversations were sometimes painful, often revelatory, and ultimately transformative. With Michael, I finally understood the pressure he had felt as the eldest son, believing he needed to surpass his father's accomplishments rather than simply honor them. His drive for expansion came not from greed, but from a misplaced sense that only dramatic growth would represent success. "I thought you and Dad would be disappointed if I just maintained what you'd built," he admitted during a long walk along the lakefront. "That I needed to make it bigger, more impressive, to be worthy of taking it over. Your father would have been proud of you for preserving what mattered most," I told him. Size was never his measure of success. Integrity was. With Angela, I discovered how her business school education had created a conflict between theory and practice. Her professors had emphasized metrics and growth strategies that worked for publicly traded corporations, but often damaged family businesses. "Everything I learned suggested that our financial conservatism was outdated," she explained over coffee. "I thought I was bringing necessary modernization, not undermining our stability." Daniel's struggle had been different. Torn between sibling loyalty and his artistic integrity, he had compromised his own values to avoid conflict. "I knew the quality was suffering," he confessed during an afternoon in his design studio. "But speaking up felt like betraying Michael and Angela. I didn't know how to honor both my family and my craft." The most profound realization throughout these conversations was how each of my children had been acting from love, however misguided, rather than disrespect. They wanted Hartwell to succeed, to grow, to remain relevant. Their methods had been wrong, but their intentions hadn't been as selfish as I'd feared in my darkest moments. 6 months after the Christmas dinner confrontation, we gathered at my home for a different kind of family meeting. A reconciliation dinner where business wasn't on the agenda. Rebecca, Thomas, and Jason joined us, along with all 5 grandchildren. The atmosphere remained somewhat tentative, the easy familiarity of past gatherings not yet fully restored, but the bitter tension had dissolved. As I looked around my dining table, one large enough for everyone with no children's table in sight, I saw a family in healing. Not perfect, not unmarked by conflict, but committed to moving forward with new understanding. 2 years have passed since that fateful Christmas when my children seated me at the kids' table. From that painful moment has emerged a stronger company, and somewhat surprisingly, a more honest family. Hartwell Custom Furniture celebrated its 42nd anniversary last month with a gala event that honored both our history and our future. The showroom displayed our dual identity proudly: the Heritage Collection, featuring James's timeless designs crafted with traditional techniques, alongside the contemporary line that Daniel has developed with remarkable success. What connects them isn't aesthetic similarity, but a shared commitment to quality and integrity. Michael has found his natural place as the company's public face and strategic visionary. With the pressure to be bigger at any cost removed, his genuine talent for identifying market opportunities has flourished within appropriate guardrails. He recently orchestrated a partnership with an architectural firm that has brought Hartwell Furniture into prestigious commercial spaces nationwide, growth that enhances rather than compromises our brand. Angela's financial acumen, tempered by the lessons of our conflict, now serves the company beautifully. She's discovered that sustainable profitability often matters more than dramatic expansion. Under her guidance, we've improved efficiency without sacrificing craftsmanship, finding the delicate balance that keeps both artisans and accountants satisfied. Daniel has perhaps undergone the most profound transformation. No longer caught between warring factions, he's reconnected with his father's legacy while establishing his own. The apprenticeship program I originally proposed has become his passion project, now with 16 young craftspeople learning techniques that might otherwise be lost to time. His contemporary collection recently won a National Design Award, with judges specifically noting how it honors traditional craftsmanship while speaking to modern aesthetics. As for me, I've embraced a role I never anticipated: elder stateswoman rather than operational leader. I serve as board chair, providing oversight and institutional memory while leaving daily decisions to those who will carry Hartwell forward. 3 days a week, I still come to the office, meeting with longtime clients and mentoring the next generation of woodworkers. The other days belong to me, for garden club meetings, community service, and most importantly, time with my grandchildren who are growing up faster than seems possible. Last Christmas brought a full-circle moment when we gathered at my home for our family celebration. As we moved toward the dining room, Michael gestured toward the table, a single large one with place cards arranged in a new configuration. "Mom," he said with gentle emphasis, "your seat is here, at the head of the table, where it belongs." The simple gesture carried profound meaning that brought unexpected tears to my eyes. More than the restored business authority or the renewed profitability, this acknowledgement of respect represented the healing I had most hoped for. As we took our places that evening, I looked around at the faces of my family. Rebecca, now expecting their third child. Thomas, finally comfortable enough to debate business topics with me directly. Jason, who had become an unexpected ally in preserving craftsmanship standards. My grandchildren, absorbing these relationships, and dynamics that would shape their own understanding of family and legacy. "Before we begin," I said, raising my glass, "I'd like to propose a toast." Everyone fell silent, wine glasses lifted expectantly. To James, whose vision continues to guide us. To lessons learned, sometimes the hard way. And to the understanding that our greatest legacy isn't the furniture that bears our name, but the values it represents: integrity, quality, and respect for both tradition and innovation. As glasses clinked around the table, I felt James's presence as strongly as if he occupied the empty chair beside me. He would be proud of where we had arrived, not despite our struggles, but because of how we had grown through them. Sometimes, life's most painful moments become our most valuable teachers. That Christmas at the children's table, humiliating as it was, forced a necessary reckoning that might otherwise have come too late. It revealed not just who owned the business, but what the business truly stood for: And in that revelation, we all found our rightful places at the table. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.